Okay. Welcome everyone to another one of our summer education sessions. We took a brief break in our theory discussion to talk more about some socialist history because it is almost the end of Pride Month and we cannot get out of Pride Month without talking about some queer socialist history. So Mikey put together a pretty great program of study for tonight's session, talking about the history of queer socialism and queer socialist movements in the United States, everything from Stonewall and beyond. And I can't wait to hear a lot about it. So, Mikey, this is all yours. Take it away.
Um, so we started our education of on the gay rights movement with Harry Hay in 1930s, 40s, 50s, when the gay identity is crystallizing in the United States. However, that's obviously not where gay people or homosexual people start. It's a little bit earlier. The first like what we would call a gay rights activist was in like 1884. He was a German lawyer, Karl Ulrich, and he like coined the first terms that were like homosexual and heterosexual because gay people were being oppressed by the law. In a lot of the early gay rights movement, early gay rights in Germany is in opposition to this law, paragraph 175, which was called the Blackmailers Charter, which basically meant that gay people were be blackmailed by blackmailers because they were gay, and obviously that's a bad thing. Obviously, this caused a bunch of distress, and he was against that, and other like sexologists. And when uh, what's his name? The one guy. The Institute of Sexual Research in Berlin, the head of that, who I've forgotten. He made a film that was the first gay film in 1917 or something, about advocating against this. Yes, Magnus Hirschfeld. Thank you. Gosh, it revoked my gay card right now. um, but he made the film in 1917, and Harry Hay, if you listen to the episode, is connected to that because one of um, one of the people who was part of Magnus Hirschfeld's group came over from Germany to America, started a club in Chicago, that and those, through like a connection of lover to lover to lover to lover, ended up being connected to Harry Hay. So, who then went on to found his own gay rights organization. So that's why that connects. And I just like to make the point that, and why am I going so far back? Because it's important to know that the even though, okay, so there's always been like gay people, gay acts, but the like specific homosexual identity does not develop until the 1880s in response to oppression, in response to laws that make homosexual acts illegal. And especially in the Victorian era, when capitalism, the capitalist Victorians, were oppressing the working class specifically and trying to make them fit their model of moralism, and sexuality was one of those things that they were oppressing. So this meant that there was more of a need for gay activism than there had been in previous times, because there had been less direct oppression, and less oppression that was in the public eye. One of the things that is useful to note is that there's that, like, okay, blackmail. It's obviously like you can only blackmail someone if they have money. So this becomes like, so when rich people start getting affected, then you see a backlash to this as well. And we see this in like Britain. They decriminalize homosexuality because rich people had started getting arrested in raids, and they were like fussing about that. When it's just like some sailor or some worker, no one really minds. Um, but that's the lead up into Harry Hay. But now I like us to like, what are you guys' takeaways from Harry Hay's interview? What questions do you have? Because I know like a tiny bit more about him, not like a huge amount, but a little bit, and a little bit about the period. So, and what did you understand about that time period?
To be honest, out of the three like readings that we had to do, the Henry Hay one stuck with me the least. I don't really remember a whole lot, like even though I listened to it this morning. Um, the other two just like had a lot more that I remembered. I did think he had like I remember him sounding wise and yeah, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I had a somewhat similar experience, but I felt that part of that was because I think I wasn't in the headspace to like approach a an interview like that
Yeah,
in the way that it was structured. Because I felt like some of the context and the editorial context that was provided was really good. It's just that there wasn't enough like sort of scaffolding to like make me understand what each of the parts was doing for the
yeah,
history. But
yeah,
my big takeaway from it, and I don't know if this was like common, to others who watched it, is like I really noticed how much Harry talked about the like even the confusion about what being gay was at the time. Like not confusion in the sense that like gay people don't know what gay people are doing, right? It's like more so that the structure of the identity doesn't really exist in a concrete way. And that really influences organizing in particular. Like he spends a really long section of this interview talking about how you just don't build an organization. We are considered outlaws. And so it's like the whole like the whole central concept of like organizing around something like an identity in the same way that the Panthers like are very aware of their black identity and their their roots and their history in that way and can like relate to one another in that organization. It seems interesting how I thought Harry was kind of explaining that it is very difficult at his time to coalesce a bunch of other queer or gay folks around an organization because like they don't trust organizations because organizations or people have burned them before was a comment he made, and b that like organization doesn't make any sense for an identity that doesn't make much structural sense on its own. It's not something that like people readily identify with in a world that is like legally fuzzy and socially questionable in the sense of like not it's not concrete, not that it's just questionable from the sense of the moralism and all that stuff.
yeah, yeah. The thing about the bad thing about that is I could have that they play that episode like after the podcast has already done like 3 seasons about like early gay rights. So if you were like a regular listener of the podcast, you completely understand it, obviously, because you would already have all this background. And I probably, but I wanted to do his interview, even though it was like a little bit obscure, because he was obviously a member of the Communist Party, got kicked out of the Communist Party because he was doing this gay rights thing. Um, but I just wanted to highlight that because it's not something like obviously the Eric Marcus, he does a podcast and he wrote the book in like the 90s or something. He's like, yeah, I didn't use any of his interview in my book because I couldn't understand it. And in my mind, I'm just like, well, you didn't understand it because he's a communist and you're not a communist, like like you didn't really get it on like a higher level. And in that way, communism gets erased from gay history, and gets like decoupled from it because obviously that wasn't, and we'll get into this, that wasn't an important thing in the 90s, that gay history was like radical. That obviously that would have never like So he would have never been thinking about that in the 90s, and he's still not thinking about it. But but at least now he's like, yeah, this is a communist who was at the head of the movement. Yeah, basically the gist of it is that he founded the Mattachine movement, Mattachine Society, which is like a social thing and like very very early gay consciousness, and yeah, after a little bit, the society itself moves less like, and as if you understood from the episode, it was not a very radical society to begin with. Like they were just trying to like meet together, but meeting together for the goal of eventually doing something more. But it becomes more conservative in that they're just like they're like, no, we'll just meet and we'll just have psychologists and that kind of thing. But yeah, let's take a step back. What was happening in the 1950s that might make homosexuals aware of being homosexual in a really big way? Does anyone know?
The Red Scare.
The Red Scare, exactly. It's the Red Scare. It happens in the 1950s, which means that homosexuals, and if you are interested, you can listen to an interview with Frank Kameny, who is the founder of the Mattachine Society of Washington, who was affected by this specific problem. And I probably should have assigned him as well because he was much more direct than Harry. But he was fired from his government job in the 1950s because he was a homosexual, as many, many people were. And he like self-litigated that shit through the courts, and I did not win, but he like sued the government for like 10 years about this. And up until so in that way, homosexuals are being specifically persecuted, which means they might be more willing to come together as an organization in a way that they didn't really feel the need to do beforehand. And it's all over I don't know exactly what the state was, but when the president is making an executive decision and maybe an executive order, has a piece of legislation about persecuting a specific group, suddenly everyone knows about that. Everyone knows about that specific group, and that specific group is going to be like, oh fuck, we should do something. I didn't realize that my having casual sex with men was a thing that could get me persecuted, but apparently it can. And that is like what leads us into the Stonewall era. So the podcast went into great depth about Stonewall, but it also went into a lot of depth about the background leading up to Stonewall. So would anyone like to tell me about what they thought about that, about the lead up to it, and then we'll talk about the riots themselves.
Before we quite get to Stonewall, do you mind if I ask a question about the sort of secrecy of these groups and whatnot?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that was something that I also sat with the Harry Hay podcast, was like he specifically said that they went out to make did you say it's the Mattachine Society? Is that how it's pronounced? Mattachine, yeah. So this society that he created, he specifically said that they would not keep address books, not write down people's names or phone numbers, and they like would not interact with anyone and would plead the fifth on everyone else, which like I understand from like McCarthy era, like not telling on people is good, but he added this particular like set of conversation about it that I thought was interesting and might be relevant for the Stonewall stuff, is like he's talking about how not just him, but other gay people have been fucked over by other queer people who like turn them into the cops in one way or another, to avoid their own persecution or whatever. And so much of the people who were like approaching him, and he mentioned this in the podcast, he was like, people would approach us and say stuff about like, hey, they would be trying to make camaraderie and community and things like that. And it wouldn't work because they couldn't trust anybody. And so, that lack of like trust meant that community can't be formed. And this also means it's really hard to form an organization. So I think this is part of what I was talking about earlier about like forming an organization. It wasn't just the identity that was messed up. It was all like messed up in the sense of just like it wasn't well defined. It was also that these communities could not trust even within their own community at the time because of the lack of sort of institutions of organization that existed to protect them. Meant that it was just like extremely dangerous to even interact with another person in that way without like knowing them super well. So I thought that was like particularly intriguing in part because a big lead up to the Stonewall discussion, at least as far in my memory, was like this person was a lover of this person, interacted with this person. You even mentioned that there's this like long chain of lovers that like a lot of this communication is getting passed not through like traditional means of like newspaper writing or even like secret note passing or anything like that. It's literally like them getting with each other. Like that's how information and organizations getting passed in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you think about this. Let's think about this in a broader context. I recently read a great book called Tea Room Trade, which is subtitle Impersonal Sex in Public Places. But it's all about how in the 30s and 40s and into the 70s, into the current day, the book is written in the 70s. How it's a main kind of like staple of gay life that you're gonna be like cruising in public places. But in that scenario, you have to be very on your guard because the fucking cops are there and they're gonna get your ass. Cops, one of the main tactics the cops use in that scenario is they like come on to you or let you approach them or something like that and basically entrap you. And so in that scenario, obviously there's a culture of like fear and a culture of untrustworthiness in the minds of gay people about like even people they think are also gay could secretly also be cops, So I think that's that's feeding into that. Yeah, Gabe.
I watched a video once that talked about like a code language, that had all this like
oh yeah
like gypsy and like a thief like
Polari
turned into almost like a gay language. Yeah, that was it. And
yeah.
that's where a lot of terms that are used nowadays, like queen and different things. But like two people could sit and if the correct word to start the conversation, they could talk to each other essentially in code and not, without revealing their identities or people overhearing and like knowing what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that even reminds me of like the kind of feeling that sex workers have today in particular about like not only doing their work, but just also trying to like find communities of protection. It's really hard for them to find safety away from like pimps and many of their other like abusers and middlemen and things like that that are often controlling or committing sex trafficking and those sorts of offenses. And it's because like cops will entrap the sex workers themselves, not the men doing sex work. Like sometimes that's a useful byproduct or whatever. They're like, oh yay, we get to arrest this guy now, like because he participated. But literally, they will entrap many of the sex workers and will even force them to do like sex acts in order to confirm that these Johns are actually supposed to be the ones getting arrested. Like that they actually went through with it. Those kinds of things, and it's like a really abusive and strong relationship between like the apparatus of the state, police power in particular in enforcing these rules, and how police get to be this special like arm of the state that does not have to obey the law in order to entrap people in doing the things that they wouldn't normally do. And like these things are not even questionably legal. They're like upheld in most courts, despite laws about entrapment. So it's interesting to think about that from like a class perspective in particular, where it's like, okay, we understand that largely society is relatively homophobic and anti-queer and anti-trans in various ways. And yet, how do the police then utilize that existing structure to enforce the class interest of the state, which is like preventing people from having alternative methods of accessing, finances or sustainability of their own like selves, and the ability to like self-determine what kind of work that they're going to do, or the life that they're going to live, just to even get basic necessities. And it's like they weaponize those moments of not only desperation but also just even of choice within the labor market, and then use that moralism to kind of cover themselves and reproduce that ideology over and over, so that everyone outside of that circle gets to go, ha, like, ha ha ha, how dare you be a sex worker, that's a crime. How dare you be gay, that's a crime. That's the thing that gets to reproduce that ideology again and again and again and again.
Yeah, I'm very glad you brought up sex work, because obviously it's like completely intertwined with gay life. Both in the fact that like gay people and sex work people have often had like the same community, and the fact that like sex workers are also gay, and in the fact that like the police use the same methods to entrap you and to harass you as in both scenarios. So yeah.
Plus,
Yeah.
I think wasn't it the mafia who was actually like started a lot of the bars and clubs?
Yes.
And
yes.
so I'm sure that there was probably a lot of other, backroom dealings, when you have organized crime involved in circumstances like that, I'm sure there's a lot of other shady stuff going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do people think of the podcast, the Stonewall podcast? What did people learn about Stonewall that you might not have known before? I don't know what people's general understanding of Stonewall is, because I've obviously listened to that podcast like 15 billion times. So what do
two
other people know about
things
Stonewall?
two things in particular stood out to me. The first one being the like under the table paying the police to like not arrest everybody, and like the like ahead of schedule, like they give them a heads up on the raids and stuff. Obviously that's not going to happen if they were a straight bar, and it's still like fucked up that they have to pay the police to not come and like do awful things. But I think it's interesting that leading up to Stonewall, they were like generally okay with being raided because they had this agreement, but like the general consensus with the working class was getting more and more fed up, and so like this final riot was like this final raid was like the tipping point. I did not know that before. I thought that was very interesting. And the second was that once the like riot had basically begun, people like just like on the street joined along with it, once again showing the like general feel, like the general vibe in New York City at the time was very like anti-establishment, very anti-police. And I didn't know that happened at Stonewall either. So those two things were like the big things for me.
Oh, I also want to say that I think that podcast was a great example of that episode specifically, but like all their episodes is a great example of like how historians deal with historical sources and that kind of thing, and they just like really lay out the because they're not like an academic institution, they can talk about every aspect of the historical sources, and they can like interact with what the public thinks. So I think that's one of their strengths. I hope that we all like learned a little bit about how history gets made from that.
Well, I think that like speaking on that point particularly, it's the common stories that we hear about Sylvia and Marsha, right? Marsha P. Johnson and was it Sylvia Rodriguez or Sylvia Rivera? That's it. Yeah. And it is, I think it is so interesting to me the way that they walked through all the different claims, and like we're walking through, okay, we do have this eyewitness account from here and this eyewitness account from here, but this eyewitness account differs from this one, and this one differs from this one. But then you ask Marsha, or you ask Sylvia, and they say two different things compared to the eyewitness accounts. And like that was that process of going through all of the like statements from police officers, from witnesses, from all of the people who like claim to be there or may not have been. I mean, apparently there was a claim that Sylvia was drugged out 3 kilometers away from Stonewall. Like, that's a claim that they make, and then apparently Marsha's the one that wakes her up on the park bench. Like, how do you try to piece this together as a historian looking at, and they even describe it pretty well, a group of largely drunk and high queer people who are all very angry.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you get a consistent story about something like that? Was, I think, super intriguing that, like, I didn't even know that there were these accounts. I didn't even know there were so many conflicting accounts, let alone secondhand accounts who were writing about these events, who clearly, at least in my mind, sound almost unqualified to be writing these accounts because they didn't have any backing to them. They were just like telephone game comments written in footnotes of books that they were looking through. It's like that.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. I will say, yeah, I have not read the book that the main books that they use there, but I will say that that's one of the, but obviously they didn't do most of that. They use, a book to explain that. And those interviews, I feel, were done that book was done in the 80s or 90s. So like decades after the fact as well. You're trying to ask someone to remember what they were doing on like a specific night in, with the, so anyways, but, and, there's so much to be said about like the mythologization of Stonewall in the public's imagination. They have a whole episode on the Stonewall movie, which I haven't seen, but I've listened to that episode that kind of like details how that like that consciousness is formed and how like history is completely like whitewashed in the public's imagination. They also have an episode on Marsha P. Johnson, and the interesting thing about Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera is that like they were like totally communist revolutionaries. They have this organization called STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Network, in which they're like, our goals are revolution, our goals are protection for our community and then revolution. And obviously that didn't happen because the capitalist interests of gay people were not willing to let that. And the capitalist interest of more respectable gay people did not want them there, and did not thought that trans people and poor people were like too much for the movement. By the mid 70s, but it's yeah, I think one of the good points about that episode is that they're like, yeah, the people who the street queens fought hardest in the riots because that was like they didn't have Marsha was like, I've been arrested 100 times, at that point whatever, they're gonna arrest me, who cares, the like state, the power of the state like stops mattering at that point. They've anyways, anything else that we took away from that?
I did have a question for you, Mikey, is like, do you think it's even worthwhile to think about who started Stonewall? Because they do mention this in the episode. That's like many mythologize about like Marsha P. Johnson through the brick, right? It's like that's the story that's told, even though quite literally there's not really any accounts of that. There was an account of a shot glass thrown in a mirror, and even that wasn't even provable.
Yeah.
There were Molotov cocktails allegedly, but they were lighter fluid and not actually alcohol. And so it's like there's a bunch of different conflicting reports. And so I'm curious, like what matters more here from a historical perspective? Is it like, do we really need the truth, or maybe is the mythology like better?
Yeah, that is kind of true. That maybe the mythology has its purpose, of course. But I think obviously the like thing about who started Stonewall. It's like they pointed out in the episode, like it's not about who started Stonewall. The question people are asking when they say who started Stonewall is like who belongs in the gay rights movement. It's about the gay rights movement right now. Now, obviously, gay people, trans people belong in the gay rights movement. That's just a fact. And they point out Street Queens fought hardest at Stonewall. This was their fight, but this was it was all people, all gay people's fight, obviously. But on that note of who started Stonewall means who started the gay rights movement. Stonewall was not the first gay riot. There was a riot at Compton's Cafeteria in 5 years earlier, which is in LA or San Francisco. It's in San Francisco. But 5 years earlier, gay people had been, obviously, as we know, with the Management Society, gay people had been building this consciousness for 20 years. And just then the time was right for something like that. So yeah, so that's kind of what I think about that. I don't really think it matters who started the violence. Obviously, the fucking police started the violence. Really, the police were being violent first. But because I think it's a community effort. It doesn't matter who one person was, because the whole community, the whole social atmosphere created the movement in that way. So in a way, we all started through. In a way, we all threw the first brick at Stonewall.
I don't know, Sarah, you may want to weigh in on this because I was curious when you were talking about some of the things of the lead up to Stonewall and the mafia in particular, what just because I'm not even sure where to place the mafia in my brain and their role in all this because it seemed kind of complex. What was your opinion on the mafia being involved in this shit? I don't know, put yourself in their shoes and be yeah, we have to both pay the mafia off and we own the bar and we're paying the cops off. What's this dynamic look like in your head?
Well, I thought it was very interesting that the mafia would get involved in that. I liked that they mentioned that the people that were running the bar were members of the mafia, but also queer. Well, maybe, possibly. I don't know. I just thought that was cool. I didn't like I already mentioned this. I didn't like the whole agreement they have with the police. But in terms of the mafia, you gotta do what you gotta do, honestly, to find a place where you can go dance with your fellow gay people. And if that means dealing with the mafia, that means dealing with the mafia.
Yeah. On the topic of the mafia, obviously it's just there's a gap in the market. Mafia are capitalists, if nothing else. There's a gap in the market, and they're going to fill that gap in the market. Other bars, other legally operating bars they were at risk of losing their liquor license if they serve gay people. The mafia don't have a liquor license in the first place. Who the fuck cares? They don't need a liquor license. So in that way, good as any other capitalist to run that bar.
Yeah, it was interesting. They said that they pulled in 5,000 to 6,000 a night, which at the time was that's a wild amount of money to pull at a bar.
They were making a lot of money.
Yeah,
for
they're
really
paying the police
sketchy drinks that are way marked up.
Yeah. Yeah. Does not sound like fun. Does not really sound like fun. But it also does sound like fun because
I'm also curious about the tensions with the split rooms. Maybe I missed this part of the podcast. If somebody could fill me in, that'd be great. Was it just lesbian and gay separation, or what was
no, it was they called the rooms the white room and the black room.
Oh shit, yeah. Okay, never mind. That reminds me. Never mind.
Yeah.
Okay, some of the reporting got a little bit weird for me because I was they were mixing up, okay, well, these people are in this room at this time during the riot, and so I wasn't sure.
Oh, yeah. They were after when the riot happened, they pulled lesbians, and then like there are like mask, like AFAB mask people, and like the inverse of that into both the rooms. But in the while the bar is operating, it's the white room and the black room, which like aren't they pointed on the podcast. They're like, it's not technically segregated. Like you can go between the rooms, but that's like is the general character of the room. And that like in the black room they have more like line dances or like unity dances and that kind of thing. And in the white room they're like coupled up, and it's more like a richer, like a more middle class clientele. So that's basically the split there.
Right, because I remember they mentioned the reporting about like people would write about Stonewall, they wouldn't go because like it seemed like ghetto to them to go because of
Yeah.
the street queens that were in like the room next door or the room that they were like happened to be in. And so they wouldn't go because they'd be like, well, I don't want to be around them, so I'm not going to go to Stonewall because it's like that's not my crowd. And it's like, okay, go get your martini somewhere else. Like what the hell?
Yeah, I want to be at a bar where I sit at the bar, stare at my drink, and do not talk to anyone because it's illegal. Yeah. Yeah. What? That's I don't know. I think Stonewall is very interesting because it has become the flashpoint of what we think of the gay rights movement as, but in the same way, it's like just like another kind of it's like not one night. It's actually like a whole week of riots. If you got to the end of the podcast, you know that it's like they kept going, they kept rioting for like a whole fucking week. But but on another hand, like that ended up becoming the Gay Liberation Front, which I don't think was a communist organization, but there were communists in the Gay Liberation Front because, like, no shit, there were. I read a whole book. I read part of a book by a guy who was like in the Gay Liberation Front. He was a communist, and he was like, "Yep, we sure were communists there." You know, we wrote this whole book about. He was like, gay people are essential to communists. I didn't assign any of it because I thought it was like getting a little bit too into like pseudo psychology kind of stuff, and I was like, anyways. But the introduction. But yeah, what do we think of? But the tension of Stonewall obviously is the class tension that there are two rooms in the bar Stonewall, that they're segregated by race and class in some ways, and that if you know of the movie Stonewall, you'll know that white people and rich people also think that Stonewall is where their gay rights started, but in some way that's not true at all. So what did we think of the article about class tensions in the gay lifestyle?
It was my favorite of the three. It was really good.
I thought it was really good as well.
Yeah.
And now I need to get my hands on his book because to like read more about this. But
Yeah, same. I wanted to read that book after because it seems like a good read. Towards the end, when they start talking about like, hold on. Oh yeah, the ambiente versus gay. I thought it was very, and like it basically highlights the same thing as like queer versus gay. Like you can be, I don't know how to phrase this, but like basically you can only ever be gay in Mexico if you're already middle class or above. But like you can, what am I trying to say? I don't know. I just thought it was very interesting, very illuminating.
yeah, I think my favorite bit was where he was like the like queer theory complex has just been like searching for the perfect unassimilatable queer person that will never bow down to heterosexuality, but that's never going to happen because of capitalism or whatever. I thought that just was like a scathing critique of queer theory that I'd never heard before. And like obviously like anti-assimilationist is like being like anti-assimilationist is good, and I think like obviously only position to have, but be a communist, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed the section kind of related to some of this where like finding the right image of the gay identity, or whatever this intersectional position is supposed to be held, the queer identity. And it's even more interesting that like it isolates the performance or the application of queer theory in particular as something that's inaccessible to a lot of these like Mexican, gay and queer folks who are trying to find these identities in these spaces. Because like not only is it just like commonly this sort of academic pursuit of the intersectionality pie, if you will, but it's also, the part of this is that like it makes no sense to perform queerness when, as you say, Sarah, like they just can't afford it, right? And so what does it mean in a world where you can't even afford the conditions of your own performance? And this like returns us to Stonewall. It's like, okay, for the street queens who are there, who are, who are fighting the cops the most, who are getting arrested the most, who are holding up the riots and making it happen, and often are a big part of the gay liberation front, but end up, leaving in some way or another for other, resistance movements, and even are the like heads of rioters and riots in other places. Remember that like these are clearly the most revolutionary group. These are the people who understand their social position the best. They understand their relationship to the state and the police and the bourgeois class the best. And that in this article, he really gets at and, wags the finger at these like rich ivory tower academics, proportionally, these rich white people in the United States who are defining, as you were saying, Mikey, their like queer liberation struggle on the backs of Stonewall, which like I love when people do point out that, Stonewall is a Black queer issue, is like a Black trans issue, is a Black lesbian issue, right? Or a Latina, lesbian issue, right? That there's, lots of intersectional analysis going on there, which is like good to some extent. But they're also much, oftentimes forgetting that just like many of these queer theorists, as he's pointing out, in academia and in like common talk about queer issues these days, are utilizing Stonewall as if it like represents them and their expression of queer identity, or even queer resistance in particular. And it's like, no, you aren't throwing Molotov cocktails with lighter fluid at the cops. Like you just aren't. My favorite quote from the podcast on this, I think, was here. It said, where was it? Sorry, it was some protest chant that they really appreciated.
Oh, ho ho homosexual, the ruling class is ineffectual.
Yes. And it's like,
I was like, yeah, we need to pull that shit out.
but they talk about how the gay liberation front also gets like co-opted a little bit toward a direction of like performance of queerness over the resistance against the system, right? Like Sarah, you mentioned, I think really poignantly, this anti-establishment sentiment in New York that is bubbling up at this time, that like because of the mafia, because of vote rigging, because of like perceived corruption in politics, the changing racial dynamics we have to think about in New York, like the, changes in relationships between Black, Irish, Latine, and other, communities that are in like the Bronx and Harlem and more, right? We have to think about all of those, all those places, and then think about, okay, wait a second. Now we've got this big, riot that happens for like a whole week. And then what do we have next? We have 30, 40 years later, we have a bunch of like white queer people saying that rights to gay marriage, as is outlined in the article, is like, yes, that's the next step of Stonewall, as opposed to the sort of abolish the family direction that was being popularized in the 70s.
Like abolish heterosexuality, no more heterosexuals, no more family structure, only communism. Yeah. But I mean, I think it also the lesson we can take from this is that you need some direction if you're going to have a political movement. they didn't really have when Stonewall started. They did not have a good direction because they're central as we talk about in the podcast. A lot of people, some of the people who were ended up in the riots in the next generation of gay activism were in the Mattachine Society. That was not an activist organization. That was not a radical organization. It was not an organization that was going to be able to move the movement forward. And in the same way, the GLF, burnt out and was not able to continue its rise. And I've read an article written at the time that was why does the GLF have, or why did gay rights? Why can't we build leaders? Why are our leaders so bad? There's a theoretical gap, a theoretical vacuum of the gay rights movement that meant that it was not able to continue the momentum. And I think that speaks of why we need theoretical basis for our organizing.
Yeah, do you think that Harry Hay is talking about that when he talks about his expulsions from the Communist Party and other places? That's and in particular the group that he started. He's like, the group that I started kicked me out because they didn't have this clear political direction. They just wanted to be a social club, right? And even in this article, I think in this interview, Zamora talks Lancaster talks quite extensively about the difference between socially being queer and queerness as politics.
Yeah.
Which is an extremely important distinction when talking about strategy. Because Lancaster is sometimes queer people just want to have fun and have reprieve from the shitty society that they are in.
Yeah.
And that's not resistance. That's just living. That's just existing.
That's just existing. Yeah, I do. I really like that bit of the article where he's stop saying everything is political. Not every action a gay person takes is a political action that is moving the movement forward or whatever. Sometimes you're just at a club, sometimes you're just having gay sex. Sometimes you're just being gay. That's not radical. Both in the way people, and people might see that as denigrating the gay people, but it's just facts. It's not that there's anything bad about being social or it's that capitalist mindset that tells you that you have to be productive all the time, and that if you can't be productive politically, that you're doing something wrong. But you need a balance, a work-life balance, a political, social balance here, and that's kind of what people should have. And if people are able to understand that their social sphere can be used for political purposes, as we know from the Harry Hay interview, where he talks about how they were getting all their information from just a successive string of lovers, can be used for political purposes, but is not political. Then you can look and say, what could I do that is more political than this? And that would be joining the YDSA. So.
That was beautiful. The way you did that was beautiful.
Not the outreach chair, just being yeah, great plug, great shameless plug right there.
Look, if you're watching this video after it premieres, you're either already in this organization or you need to be.
There you go. That's the clippable moment, Sarah. It's got to go on the YouTube.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
No, that was good. I do agree. I do want to I want to only challenge you, Mikey, in that I want to hear more from you on this, because I think you could probably say it better than me, is When people often talk about, because I'm in spaces like in particular like collegiate debate, where I'm in a lot of spaces where they say like, performance and existence is resistance, right? That it is like some kind of like inherently political act in spaces that are oppressive toward you. So could you maybe flesh out a little bit more, maybe with an example or something from this history that we're talking about like why is it that even in a world where like being gay is literally marked as illegal or is like, policed in that way, how is the sort of like everyday performance of that identity or the enactment of, like being in the bar or hanging out with other folks, how is that not inherently political on its own?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'm of two minds on it. On one hand, I'm like, well, it is, it is a political act because everything has political implications. If the government is interested in it, then it's political. But at the same time, it's not political in that it's not advancing the cause of either gay liberation or socialism or any related movements. For example, if you're a guy who like every Friday night you go down to the gay bar and like hook up, that's in resistance to like the government, and that could cultivate some like anti-police, anti-government sentiment in you. But like that's not going to bring you class consciousness, as we know, because gay people have been doing that since like the fucking dawn of time, and they had not yet cultivated the class consciousness, you know? And in the same way, there are people, every single like worker is working and the government hates them because like capitalism. But like surviving and living is not um resisting, because it's not like fighting back. It's There's like a passivity to it that is, you need to take that like passive reflection and like turn it into active political action. But yeah,
Yeah, Marx and Engels talk about this when they do like dialectical philosophy. They talk about the distinction. I've been reading about this recently, so let me know if it gets too esoteric. It's like essentially that there's a difference between accident and necessity, and so it's like when they talk about historical events or like individual events, they're thinking about the same example you just provided, like that going out to the bar every Friday and doing a thing that the government says is illegal. Like, okay, doing cocaine as like white collar person is illegal. Is that resistance? Is that political? Like probably not. Like that is not like a political resistance movement. And Marx and Engels would describe that as like as accident, right? That those are like individual events that exist, and maybe they have like political character. It's possible there are like many individual events that have political character. For example, the like screaming at cops has its own political character and can raise the consciousness for others when the cops react to you and have that relationship with you and like demonstrate that relationship live. Because plenty of other people who Sarah was talking about, like they didn't know that they joined from the streets and became a part of this riot as it was happening. And similarly, they talked about the pride events that happened afterward, or like what we now call pride anyway. That these riots that happen in plenty of places or like demonstrations and whatnot, like emerged after people saw the thing happen and then went, oh, I can join that because I see it now and I see what's happening in front of me and I can like sort of get some political consciousness from that while also participating in the event. So to boil it down, it's like, okay, the going to the gay bar is an accident, is like an incident. It's just it's a single event. But what turns it into political is when it becomes a strategy, when it becomes a part of the necessity of like class struggle, where like gay liberation is literally like when the street queens are saying, I don't give a shit if I get arrested because I've been arrested 100+ times, right? They are saying, we have already faced this, we recognize our class position. Now we can take that in the political direction and say, this is our position of class war against the police and against the state. Like that's the direction I imagine it's going. Yes.
Yeah. I think thank you for bringing the like hard-hitting theory into this, because I know the history. I'm not that well versed in the theory, but you know all the theory, so this is the dialectical balance.
I just read a book that was like, no, literally Marx and Engels argued a bunch because Marx was saying to Engels that like he would write Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3, but he wouldn't write them so that all of the arguments were answered in Capital Volume 1 from his critics, because he was going to make a bunch of like really bad assumptions in Capital Volume 1, and then in Volume 2 and 3 fix those assumptions over time. Because what Marx literally wanted to do, and I promise you this makes total sense, that he wanted to bait his like ops.
Oh my god! Oh my
Right,
god! The
polemics.
original rage bait! Oh my god!
Only for him to publish a book, like hopefully a couple years later, like literally within the year, he was hoping to publish volume 2, and then within the year publish volume 3, so that they would be embarrassed by making those polemics.
That's amazing. I
That's
love that.
that's Marx for you.
But also knowing that he like didn't publish them all.
Yeah, he didn't even publish them. And Engels was pissed when he found all the manuscripts, because the manuscripts they literally wrote in the margins. Marx is like, "This is done. Like this is complete." And Engels is like, "Bro, had I known this was complete, I would have forced you to complete it and actually publish it." So, like, why do I have to piece this together for a decade after you're dead? Like, what is going on? Anyway, that's a big side tangent. But essentially, I just like, because I've been thinking about like dialectical philosophy, I thought that was interesting. The like your analysis about this isn't political, this article's analysis about this isn't political, definitely comes from a materialist view that's like, okay, we can understand that individual events happen, but we also don't have to understand those events as like necessary to the process of political change, regardless of whether they may be like anti-state technically because of the legal institutions, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, think about like marijuana use. I don't think it's political necessarily to use marijuana illegally in states where it is currently illegal, right? It's also federally illegal. All the states that have legalized it, it's still illegal. Like just because the federal government is not enforcing it does not make it somehow like a significant, a political action to use marijuana. So the question becomes like, where do we draw the line between what's political and what's not? And that's like a conversation for many, many days. But I think that it's good to just be like, also, can we just like not burden queer people with everything they have to do has to be political?
Yeah.
Big thought.
Okay. On your note about how the Stonewall riots turn into pride, essentially, and this is in this podcast, they have an episode on the Australian pride, history of pride in Australia, which they call Mardi Gras. And on the like 10-year anniversary of Stonewall, the like American organizers of the American Pride marches wrote to like a bunch of different people around the globe and were like, hey, we're having a 10-year anniversary, would you like to celebrate with us and like do pride in your country? And that's essentially how pride got spread across the globe. Like people did not like look at America and be like, we could have that. The Americans were like, do you want to join us? Which frankly makes more sense. But yeah, but anyways, so there's a lot of like history there that people often gloss over, and they're like, Stonewall happened and then gay rights, and that's just
Yeah, are we gonna forget ACT UP, HIV/AIDS? Are we gonna talk about Reagan? Are we gonna forget that like there
not
was
right now, but
no, I get that. I'm just like, it's that question I had before about like mythology versus truth, right? Mythology is useful. Like people love having hope in that mythology, and it's like useful for organizing in that sense. In the same way that people like idolize various socialist leaders and their successes and like mythologize them in various ways. Like that's totally true. I mean, like there are people right now who are making like great anime edits of Zoran Mamdani because he won the Democratic primary, and like they are in some ways kind of like creating a sort of mythos around him before he's even in office, and like that's good in the sense that it gets people kind of in conversation about these things. But it's a question about how do we use that mythology in like a direction that is strategic, as you said. Like you have to have a plan. Otherwise, these groups just become social clubs, and we just like spin around again and again and again, going, "Oh no, crap's messed up," and let's go have a party. Like that's that's the kind of stuff we get stuck around.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Oh yeah, mythology is really important because it does create like a social consciousness of gay people and like creates like a gay identity. I think Stonewall and HIV/AIDS and ACT UP and all these things are like kind of integral to like being gay. In my experience, at least, I don't know if like other gay people also have this experience. Maybe it's just because I'm really into history. But like when I was like coming out as like a teenager, what I was learning about, I was learning a whole bunch about like gay rights and gay protests and all this. So to have this like history of protest in as your basis for what is gay is, I think, a really good thing. I think it's a very beneficial thing, and to have easily understandable stories is good, but at the same time you have to go deeper. You have to do actual history, and you have to have a very solid materialist understanding of things if you want to take any real lessons from them. But I think having them in like public consciousness is good to get people to even to get people to know where they need to look for historical stuff. Even if you're like, I don't know anything about protests, I don't know anything about organizing, but I know that in the 80s they did ACT UP, and I know that in the 70s there was the Gay Liberation Front. You can go look those up, and you can read books about them, and you can watch YouTube videos or whatever, and you suddenly have like an into understanding political action, whereas like you wouldn't have had that if there was like no mythology. But yeah, so it can be useful, and also the like format. Like obviously, I wish people didn't just spread lies. I wish people would stop fucking lying all the time about history and about about Stonewall. I think about Stonewall specifically, obviously, but also about just like gay rights generally. But I don't know. I don't think there's like huge lies about gay rights and gay history specifically. Just like there's just like a lack of understanding of any kind of gay background and kind of a lack of understanding. No, I'm lying. There is a huge misunderstanding about gay history, and it's all about ancient Greece and Rome. That's my pet peeve, and I won't get into that right now, but that's what I hate when people talk about ancient Greece and Rome, because they never get it right. But like modern gay history, if you know anything about modern gay history, you probably know a little bit about what it is, and you probably don't have like a class-based analysis of it, but like no one has a class-based analysis of anything these days. That's what we're trying to do here. But yeah.
So plug join YDSA. Yeah.
Yeah, join the YDSA. Join the YDSA. We're trying to do class-based analysis. Anyways. But anyway, but I want to bring it back, do that class-based analysis, and say, look, we have in the 50s, we have an organization that forms because of pressure on homosexuals. The government is putting pressure on homosexuals. They're firing homosexuals from their jobs. And in a capitalist society, we all know that losing your job is a terrible, terrible thing. I would like us all to know that those policies that kept gay people from being in federal jobs remained in practice until the early 90s. You could not be in a federal job and be out as gay until like 1995 or something. Like that's insane. That's so recent. Also tomorrow is the 22nd anniversary of Florence v. Texas, the case which legalized sodomy in the United States in 2003. So Daddy's only 1 year older than me, which is so recent.
That makes me want to cry.
I was born the same year.
I know.
What?
So yes.
Like, like it's so weird to think about because like we do talk a lot about like Obergefell v. Hodges, right? Like gay
Yeah,
marriage, right?
yeah,
And marriage equality. And I like that Lancaster in this article does this interview talks about that a lot. He's like, okay, remember that the way that like queer movements are happening right now, and you think about like pride and all these other things, is they are moving toward what they want as a middle class life. They're looking toward things like the American dream, but just gay. Like the gay middle class bourgeois life. That is what they want. And they want a life of unbothered capitalism. Like that's what they want.
yeah,
And in a
yeah.
lot of ways, which is really messed up. And and so it's just like it's interesting to think about that from the perspective of like yes, we need to talk about how in history we are literally the this is the age of that act being legal in the United States. Like
Yes,
sodomy
yes.
being legal in the United
And that's
States.
barely, there were like several countries that beat us to the punch on that one. Like we were kind of late. Like obviously there are still countries where homosexuality is illegal, but we were not in the first cohort of countries to decriminalize homosexuality.
Well, I
So
heard in the podcast, I think Britain was one of the earlier
Britain
ones.
technically, okay, Britain technically decriminalized homosexuality in 1961, but I don't really count that because because as I was previously saying, they basically decriminalized it so that like rich people wouldn't get in trouble. You had to, oh my god, it's so insane. You could have gay sex, but it had to be in private, with consensual of you had a higher age of consent than straight people. Age of consent was 21 for gay people and 16 for straight people. But the in private thing really gets you because in private meant that not only that it could have had to be like in your personal house, there couldn't be another person in the house with you. It had to be just you and the person you were having sex with in the house. Otherwise, it was illegal. You couldn't have sex with three people because they considered the third person to be like not make it not private. So like you couldn't have. So it was kind of insane. But that essentially means that like people who are having sex in private, the sex that was already fucking legal because you're not breaking into anyone's homes to arrest them for having gay sex, like that becomes legal. But like the actual sex that gets prosecuted, cruising, public sex work, that kind of stuff still remains illegal in Britain until I'm not sure when that gets decriminalized. And I'm not sure when the age of consent is legalized. Is equalized. I think it's in the 90s, but I don't quote me on that. But
So
yeah,
yeah, stop me if I'm wrong, connecting that a little bit to the classic like trans bathroom fights and the locker room fights and the sports fights and stuff like that that are happening right now. Where
yeah,
to me it sounds like we can't forget that like trans resistance is queer resistance is gay resistance, like all of these
yeah,
things
yeah.
matter and are connected and together. We're not going to leave trans people out of our analysis for damn sure, but in
I would
particular,
hope.
yeah, I bet you would hope not. Yeah,
Yeah,
no.
yeah. I just
So
want everyone to know that whenever I say gay, I don't mean just like why like men having sex with men. I meant like the whole thing. So just to clarify for everyone who thinks I'm being transphobic.
yeah, so I want to kind of connect that legal stuff you were just talking about because I think it's really important to think about how like going to the bathroom was not like a subject of legal conversation until like the last decade, right? Like,
I would push back on that
oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
because I would push back on that because, as I previously talked about, I read this great book called Tea Room Trade. What's a tea room? It's a bathroom where people have sex.
Oh,
So the bathroom is a highly politicized site of, you know, highly politicized when basically in this book he's like in the 30s the government built a bunch of these bathrooms under the Works Progress Administration in like public parks and that kind of thing. And these are obviously political things because first of all people have sex there, second of all they're like government facilities, so like the state is there, and like third of all obviously like, having access to a public bathroom is like a human right. But when you live under capitalism it's not so simple. um and so that's what I would say, that the bathrooms, men's bathrooms, I guess. Like right now, it's kind of like women's bathrooms. Women's bathrooms are also political. Like we didn't used to have like segregated bathrooms. I hear we used to have like just one bathroom, and like women were just expected to never be outside the home. um,
That's insane. That's the
and
craziest
then they
thing.
like created women's bathrooms because women started like going outside more or whatever. They like realized they couldn't be in the same bathrooms as men, and were like, oh no. So like even the segregation of bathrooms is like a political act that someone decided to head to. Yeah, but that was not the point. That was not the point at all. Um,
Yeah, no, it's okay, it's okay.
yeah,
I wanted to talk about like how that's interesting. I didn't know that much history with the private, like with the legal questions around bathrooms, but I guess I mean more so that the like
so
the national political conversation about bathrooms has been obviously recently inflamed. I know I can say that with
yeah,
confidence.
yeah.
Um,
I think people are definitely thinking about it way more than they've ever fucking thought about it ever in their entire lives.
yeah. Like I don't even imagine like the World War II vets are not really caring what bathroom that they're using. They were using whatever the hell bathroom they wanted to and for a long time. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I think it's interesting to me because it connects with the sort of legal fights that the queer liberation movement and queer socialists have been having for a long time. Is like they are fighting on two fronts. They are both fighting the like common fascistic policies that are trying to prevent them from existing, right, in the first place. Then there's another layer of the sort of like liberal versus left infighting where you have things like the what was it, the ho ho homosexual chant, right, that's at the rally about how the capitalist system is ineffectual, and it's like, okay, you know, this is obviously something that we should like abolish and take down. And then that message gets watered down over the course of time because these become more social clubs and less resistance movements. And we can trace this now to the sort of legal fights when everything is tied to legalism. It means that the language at which you can use to resist those things is not in the context of like communist abolition. It is always in the context of sort of liberal reform. So in this context of like the bathroom bills, when you're arguing against a bathroom bill, you literally have to go up there and say, no, people should have the right to use the fucking bathroom that they want to use. And like, that's the only language that is relevant or germane to the bill. And literally in legislatures and in city council meetings, they will tell you you cannot talk about things that are not germane to the legislation or whatever. And so you couldn't, for example, introduce something like a class analysis, or you couldn't talk about why is it that this like heteropatriarchal structure is really messed up and, you know, and bad, and we should resist that, because they will literally say, no, are you going to talk about the bill or not? And it's like, it's those moments that show, yeah.
As a communist, you had to start every like political opinion that you have with at least like 100 to 150 years of history.
Yes. Oh, true. I literally have done that about 7 times this conversation, but it's like,
yeah,
that. Think about like Obergefell v. Hodges, right? Okay, in um, in Lancaster's article, he's literally talking about how the fight for gay marriage is a literal pacification of a lot of the work that gay resistance movements have been doing for all of this time to build up this political and class consciousness, and now is refiltered through bourgeois ideology, this imagination that's like, no, don't worry, everyone. As long as you can attain, like, we'll give you the access to this middle class life that you're seeking, or at least we'll promise it and never fill, of course. Yeah.
I mean, we'll give you the
Unsatisfied.
opportunity to access. We'll give you the opportunity to access, but it's capitalism. Not everyone gets it.
Exactly.
So, you know,
I will
also say,
we'll pretend you have the opportunity too. It's like, we'll give you the opportunity. We'll give you the shitty opportunities that the heteros have. Like these opportunities that you don't want, we're going to give them to you and call it equality. Like that's what I'm talking about with this like legalism as opposed to you know, sort of political orientations and whatnot, is like it's impossible for us to even think about the questions of abolishing the family or these structures like the nuclear family. It's impossible for us to have these conversations because we're always having them in the context of the next piece of threatening legislation, not in the context of a broader like paradigm of future that we can go toward.
Yeah, and I'd like to say a little bit about the legislation because I really don't actually think that like bathroom trans stuff is really very threatening at all. And I don't think it actually does anything. Like I've kind of been thinking of this for most of the since it has been happening, everyone is very panicked about it. But here's the thing, have we really seen like a rash of like arrests or harassments or anything that could be concretely tied to these bills? No, because it's completely legal to go to the bathroom as a trans person if you pass. And people who don't pass, they know that, and they don't go to the wrong bathroom. You go to the bathroom that aligns with your gender presentation because that is legal. And also, they're not fucking checking your ID. You would have to check my ID at the fucking door of the bathroom, and the government is not going to spend that kind of money. So in a way, these like legislation is useless. It's a culture war issue. It's something that the right can put up and say, look, we're fighting this thing, and then they can do a bunch of like corporate capitalist stuff behind this, just like abortion, where that's actually a thing that actually affects people. But like this is an even faker, kind of thing. They're like, look, we're solving the trans issue. We're doing this corporate money thing on the side, and the Democrats can say, we're fixing the trans issue. We're not doing these things, and then do the corporate money stuff over here, bombing, war in the background, and they can like fight over this thing. When really, I don't think that most trans people's lives have really been affected by the like currently under Kansas law, it's illegal for a trans person to use the bathroom that is misaligned or whatever, but that hasn't stopped a single person, I don't think, like because no one is arresting you for this. There's no way to enforce these laws. And even the kind of like legal stuff of like having your sex misaligned on your ID, which I think is like more important, is like when most people don't care about that because and I'll say this as someone who's been like using an ID that doesn't align with my presentation and that didn't used to align with my name. That's how I got all of my jobs and my housing and all these kind of things. Obviously this is bad that it has to rely on this like case by case basis, but we're living in a world where like most people are not thinking of people are being less and less discriminatory in that way. And
yeah, the only pushback I provide is there are a couple of examples these days where like some cis women have been harassed in women's bathrooms. Actually, I think there's more cis women that have been harassed.
No, that's the thing. Is this is a documented pattern before any of these bills were introduced. This is a documented pattern that cis butch women commonly experience. And like gender scholars like Judith Butler and Jack Halberstam talk about this in their books. They're like, this is the bathroom problem in the 90s. They're like, do I use the women's bathroom when I know I'm going to get harassed by some cis women because I'm a butch woman? Like this is a problem that exists way before this. So like, yeah, it was a thing that's already been existed and it kept existing after they passed this bill. And so, yeah.
So are you saying you kind of see this like, I mean, obviously the debates about the bathroom bills are a distraction. Let's all be real about that. They are not, these are not real policy goals. They are meant to do what, who said it? I think it was Michael Knowles who said like eradicate trans people from public life. Like that is the program they are following.
That's the goal, but they're not very good at it because most trans people, you can't tell, are passing, are living in life. They're, just like homosexuals, you cannot tell where they are. We are everywhere.
The I can always tell crowd is the funniest shit on the internet, to be fair. Like, they not only call out way too many like cis people for being trans, and
like
will just
transvestitators, they're the funniest shit. I love them so much.
yeah. And then the thing
But I
is
think
that
they're
when
like gay.
they're often so wrong about trans people, it's like even
Yeah.
funnier because
Yeah.
those same
So
trans
funny.
people will pull up their comments and be like, "Oh, really? You know? You think you know?"
Yeah.
It's just so
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's not effective, and it has not yet been effective. Now, let's hope to God it keeps being not effective.
Mhm.
But it seems in the material world and not in the legal world that the rights of trans people and the experience of trans people are not aligning with what the legal establishment would have you believe. It's true, obviously, that like most trans people are poor. Most people are poor, and suffer from the consequences of that in the capitalist system. But that's why we need socialism. So yeah, I think that's kind of why I'm um, that's kind of why I'm not worried, and I think it's a little bit silly that people are, it's a distraction. It's a distraction from the wars and the corporate interests and the capitalism of it all. So, and in that way, the 1961 Wolfenden Commission, which decriminalized some of homosexuality in Britain, is very similar because it purports to decriminalize homosexuality, doesn't actually decriminalize homosexuality for most people. And in the same way, these trans legislation purports to be a backlash against trans rights when in reality doesn't affect most trans people. Like, trans people have been living with documents that are mismatched to their ID since there have been IDs and trans people, and somehow they figured out how to do it. You know, um, it's I just think it's I think that's just the state of things. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Go ahead, Mikey.
No, I'm trying to think of. Anyways, the next section of research I've been doing is just on communist gay people in communist countries, and I have a lot to say about that. But that will be like, I don't know, in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I don't know, whenever we want to do that.
I mean, would the people in this room be interested in doing that? I mean, Mikey, would you be interested in doing that next week? It would still give me more time to prep
Yeah.
the ABCs of Socialism. Yeah, the only thing I want to mention is that next week is the 2nd of July. So it's a thought. We could do it.
Not like we're celebrating America or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's some people who are gearing up for, potentially protests or things like that on the weekend, but I imagine it shouldn't be too intrusive. Okay, so we'll decide at tomorrow's meeting what education session we do next week. We'll see what people wanna hear. Sarah, were there any like closing thoughts about like the history or anything you wanted to add to this conversation? I saw you unmute a few times. I don't want you to have like missed anything.
Sorry if I've just like talked this whole time, but I don't know.
There's not really anything I have to add about that. I was waiting until you stopped recording because I have something to tell you guys that's just like off topic, but yeah, I don't have anything else to say.
Okay, then Mikey, do you have any closing thoughts before the recording ends?
I think the bit in the article where he says, socialism isn't for Black people or gay people or women. Socialism is for everyone. Should be the closing thought. Socialism will benefit every single person, and we should all be socialists, and we should all be living in a socialist country. We should make this right here our socialist country. So
love that. Well, thank you everyone for the discussion. This was really good.